Hello, welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society webinar series. My name is Courtney McWhirter. I will be your host for today. Digital Enterprise Society is a new nonprofit member association organized to enable the transformation of product development, design, delivery, and maintenance throughout the digital enterprise, regardless of software tools used. We are dedicated to the transformation of the manufacturing enterprise workforce. We'd like to invite you all to join Digital Enterprise Society. The society was formed by a PLM World Transitional Board of Directors. As part of the transition, past PLM World members have been granted free access to Digital Enterprise Society membership. If you had a login on the PLM World website or attended a PLM World event, including Siemens PLM Connections or regional user group events, your free membership is waiting. Visit digitalenterprisesociety.org, select sign in, and reset your password using your email address associated with your PLM World account. If you're brand new to Digital Enterprise Society and did not have a PLM World account, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Use promo code webinar09 to claim your free membership. Once again, my name is Courtney McWhirter. I am the Marketing Communications Manager at Digital Enterprise Society. If you have any questions about membership or getting involved, please feel free to contact me. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Scott Hutcheson. Scott is a faculty member in the School of Engineering Technology at Purdue University. His focus is on the science and practice of complex collaboration as it relates to the strategic transformation of organizations, communities, and economies. He teaches both undergrads and graduate students. Scott has also worked with over 500 companies and communities in the U.S. and internationally to help their leaders and more effectively manage their most complex challenges. Before I turn it over to Scott and we get started, I'd like to encourage you to add any questions that you have throughout today's presentation in the questions window. We will have a brief Q&A following the presentation. So Scott, I will turn it over to you.
All right, well, hello everyone. Thanks for spending part of your Monday and part of your afternoon with us today. And we are going to talk about strategy related to the digital transformation of our organizations and our products, and kind of frame that as something that's pretty difficult. So I want to get a sense right up front from you, kind of what your opinions are related to digital transformation. So here's a quick poll. As you consider the digital transformation of your organization, would you describe that transformation as something that is, and you see the choices there, pretty easy, somewhat difficult, very difficult, or nearly impossible? So take a minute and give us your answer, and we'll see how that turns out.
Scott, it looks like we currently have 50-30% coming in at very difficult, around 30-35% somewhat difficult, and 10% have said nearly impossible.
All right.
If you haven't already, go ahead and submit your response to that poll. We'll close it in just a minute here. We're sitting now at 5% somewhat easy, 36% somewhat difficult, 50% very difficult, and 9% nearly impossible. So we'll go ahead and you got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll go ahead and close that poll.
All right. Okay. Well, it sounds like folks have kind of confirmed the title of our webinar today, Digital Transformation Strategy. It's not rocket science. In fact, I'm going to argue that it's harder. So that's not just a saying. It's actually based on an experience a colleague of mine had. So I'm from Purdue University, as you know, and we know a thing or two about rocket science. This is a place where there are real live rocket scientists and others that support putting people into space. So that, of course, is Neil Armstrong, first man to walk on the moon, and a proud Purdue grad. So Purdue's a place with real life rocket scientists. So this is a story that was told to me by one of my faculty mentors. So it was the beginning of a school year, and there was some welcoming reception at which there were some libations. And my colleague does, or did before he retired, the kind of work that I do. He helps organizations transform and do strategic transformation in those organizations. So Sam is my colleague's name. So Sam tells the story that he was at this faculty reception. He got a beer and made his way to one of those cocktail tables. And there was another gentleman about Sam's age. And Purdue's a big place with lots of faculty, so you don't know everyone. So Sam introduced himself, and turns out this guy was a real life rocket scientist. He was an aeronautical engineer, faculty member. So told Sam a little bit about his work, and then he said, "Now, what do you do, Sam?" So Sam told him, and Sam happens to be an economist. It's his training, but as I said, he works with organizations and sometimes entire regional economies to help them transform. So Sam shared what he did, and then this other professor said to him, he said, "Sam, well, that's not rocket science, is it?" And to tell Sam, or to hear Sam tell the story is a lot of fun. Sam is a small man. He's probably only 5'6" and probably 135 pounds soaking wet. So he doesn't look very intimidating. But what a lot of people don't know is that Sam actually used to be a professional bull rider before he had a career in academia. So he's a tough guy. So as Sam tells this story, he says that he could feel his blood pressure going up and thinking, what an arrogant, I forget what choice word he used to call the guy, thinking that he was disparaging what Sam does. But then the very next words out of that other faculty member's mouth was that he said, "No, Sam, you don't understand. What you do is harder than rocket science." So here's what that faculty member was getting at. Transformation of organizations is really, really complex. So you can go all the way back to the 1950s, where Kenneth Boulding, guy who wrote and was kind of the father of general systems theory, he put together this hierarchy of systems in levels of complexity. So he says the most basic systems are systems of frameworks, whether those are buildings or whether those are cell structures, and then clockworks, so machines, and cybernetics with feedback systems. Then, of course, we have botanical systems with our flora and fauna, and then zoological with our animals, and then we have human systems, human within our own body. There's a system to help us learn. But then there's these organizational systems, and you can go even one step further with inter-organizational systems, where there are multiple organizations working together. So what that faculty member was saying is that rocket science really is clockworks. When we figured out how to put rockets in the moon, it's pretty predictable. It works the same way nearly every time. And when it doesn't, we figure out what's wrong and we tweak it. It's a very predictable and not really complex. It's complicated, but I would argue that it's not complex. These organizational systems, these inter-organizational systems especially, are really, really complex. They're the most complex systems that we encounter. So we're going to talk a little bit about digital transformation in that context, the digital transformation of our organizations, and try to give you some insights into why it is so much more difficult than it often seems like it should be. So we're going to touch on these things. We're going to talk about this idea of complex adaptive systems and how seeing our enterprises, our organizations as these systems can help us in our digital transformation. We're going to talk a little bit about hierarchies and networks and their roles in implementing digital transformation. We're going to talk a little bit about why traditional approaches to strategic transformation, whether you're talking about digital transformation or any other really, are so often ineffective. And then we'll look at something that's probably familiar to you, the SCurve, the growth curve. but maybe a slightly different application of it to help us understand some insights as well. And then lastly, we'll help you with some information on why thinking differently, behaving differently, and doing differently are essentials to strategic transformation. So let me start with a little bit of my background and what got me interested in this kind of work with organizations. So my first real job out of school was with a project that involved the companies that you see on this page: American Airlines, Marriott, Hilton, and Budget. So I was hired. I had some experience in hotels in college and was hired to be part of a software development project involving those 4 organizations. And we weren't really calling it digital transformation, but that's what it was. So Marriott, Hilton, and Budget hired American Airlines to develop a state-of-the-art reservation system for hotels and rental cars. And American Airlines had developed Sabre, which was the airline reservation system that not only they used, but almost every carrier used, as well as travel agents. So back then you had to call a travel agent if you weren't working directly with the airline. So American had done that before. So I got hired to help develop a software solution. It was a buy build. We were buying elements of it, but building elements of it as well, of course, to put that thing together. So let me give you the scope of this thing. It was a 4-year timeline with about 400 people working on it. $115 million budget. At the time, it was the largest software development project in the history of the world. So we get on the job and we are handed 75,000 pages of functional specifications. Literally the recipe, the cookbook of how to build this thing. And I can still remember that it wasn't digital. There was digital available, but we had a library room. And to put this into perspective, I think 75,000 pages is about 37 reams of paper. So picture, the ream of paper that you see in your office copier room, 37 of those stacked on top of one another. That was the functional specifications that we had. And they basically said, just create that and we're good. So as these things work, you break the functionality down into chunks, if you will, and teams would work on the chunks. And then about 3 years in, we got to integration testing, where we put all the chunks together, we stitched them together, and we turned it on. And guess what? Didn't work. Nobody panicked yet. Took a look under the hood, tried to turn it on again, and it didn't work. And in fact, it never worked. And it went down in history, and I think it remains historically the largest software development failure, again, in the history of the world. And this was my first job, so it was quite a resume builder for me. But it didn't taint me too much since I was so low on the totem pole. So that was one experience that said, wow, really complicated or complex work being done. I mean, the functional specifications were very clear. We knew what we were to do, yet it failed. So let me tell you one other experience and how that impacted me. So this one actually predates it. So this should say 1983, so a few years before the 89. So I was an undergrad in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And Chattanooga, Tennessee in the late 70s and early 80s was noted as the most polluted city in America. And it had all kinds of other problems as well. So heavy industry, textiles mostly, but textiles was moving out of the US where inputs were cheaper. And so the economy was failing, the schools were failing. Chattanooga was just not a great place to be. I got hired. I took an odd job. So at my school, I was an undergrad there. At my school, we had an odd job board. You could pick up a 3x5 card and go do yard work for somebody or lots of other jobs. And this one was to be a flip chart recorded a bunch of kind of community meetings, and it was an effort called Vision 2000, Chattanooga Vision 2000. And Chattanooga was trying to strategically transform itself, okay? And I didn't think much of it. I went on and finished my schooling there and left, but then life took me back to Chattanooga later, and in less than 10 years, Chattanooga was completely transformed. So Outdoor Magazine, as you see there, noted it the best U.S. city for outdoor living. Not only that, it's a remarkable place. They have the highest speed internet of any city in the U.S. A vibrant entrepreneurship culture, a lot of new tech companies. It's just a really exciting place to be. So I got curious, those two experiences, two different experiences where people were coming together to do really complex work. One was technically complex, the other was socially complex, if you will. One, a historic failure, and the other, a remarkable success. So it got me interested in this question: how does complex transformational work get done in environments with lots of different agendas, lots of different organizational cultures or subcultures even within one organization, and lots of systems of carrots and sticks, or incentives and disincentives? So to state that another way, how do you get really important stuff done when really nobody can tell anybody else what to do? And that was the situation in both of those instances. Nobody could tell anybody really what to do in Chattanooga, yet they were really successful. And on the surface, for the American Airlines project, on the surface, it seemed like people could tell other people what to do. I mean, I had a boss and we all got paychecks, but really, you can't. To some extent you can, but in many ways in our organizations, we really can't tell people what to do. And especially right now in 3% unemployment, people don't want to do what you tell them to do. Well, they'll just go find another job. So the area that I have really worked in for the last 20 some years is what I think of as the science and practice of complex collaboration. How do we do really complex work when we have to work in these more collaborative sorts of networks, and no one really has all the resources needed to make transformative things happen? So let's think about your organization. So I guarantee you that this is a question you've probably never been asked before, but here's the question. When it comes to your organization, is it more like a toaster or a house plant? Now, what in the world do I mean by that? Well, here's what I mean. So think of a toaster. A toaster is designed for doing the same task every time you ask it to perform over and over and over with great predictability. Well, what about a house plant? Well, it's a little bit more complex than the toaster, isn't it? So a house plant, well, it grew from a seed. It's part of an ecosystem of sunlight and water and soil nutrients, and it takes in carbon dioxide from the environment and it releases oxygen, and with just a little bit of care, it can thrive. So which is your organization most like, a toaster or a house plant? Well, that's kind of a trick question, because most of our organizations have to be a little bit of both. There's a little bit of toaster in us, and there's a little bit of house plant. So let's look at the kinds of functions that we are asked to do in our organizations. So we're all dealing with different kinds of problems, different kinds of challenges. Simple stuff, complicated stuff, and complex stuff. So I'm at a university, right? Registration, fairly simple. Fairly simple. We are in a building boom on our campus. So lots of cranes and building construction going on. That's pretty complicated. It's not simple, it's complicated. But look at that complex stuff, research, curriculum development. That's complex. Maybe some of you are in automotive. Well, assembly, not super simple, but fairly simple. We get pretty good at setting up assembly lines. Supply chain management, well, that can get complicated. We know that. But what about, the future of transportation? Well, now that's complex. So let's dig in a little deeper. So simple and complicated are both technical problems. But a complex issue, I think of as an adaptive challenge. So complicated problems can be solved. They may take a while, may take more trial and error, but we figure them out and we get them solved. And of course, simple problems get solved. But adaptive challenges, well, those are different. So let's look at this notion of complexity. Well, what do we mean by complexity? Well, here's what I mean. You got a number of different nodes, if you will. And what do I mean by nodes? Well, people, things, data points, a lot of different things at a lot of different nodes interacting in a lot of different ways. So those could be human relationships, that could be data transmission. So complicated, you may have a lot of nodes, but or a low number of nodes, but a high degree of interactions. But that complex is the sweet spot, and it gives a lot of us a lot of heartburn, where you have lots of different nodes interacting in a lot of different ways. So here's another poll. So Courtney, we're going to do another poll here. Now, as you consider digital transformation of your organization, based on what you just heard about simple, complicated, and complex, which would you describe it as? Is it simple? Is it complicated? It's a problem that can be solved, but it's going to take a while. Or is it complex? Lots of different nodes, lots of different interaction among those nodes. I'll give you a second to complete that poll.
Looks like we have just over 60% of our attendees here have voted, so go ahead and get your votes in for that poll. Currently, we're sitting at 20% complicated and 80% complex.
All right.
All right, I'm going to be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3. We're at 80%. Last 20%. 2. Anybody else want to get a vote in? We're at 35% complicated and 65% complex. And with those numbers, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll.
All right, thank you. So let's talk a little bit more about the difference between complicated and complex. So here's the fundamental difference. Complicated problems are problems that may be hard to solve, but they are solvable. We have the right tools and the right processes. Complex challenges, well, they can't really be solved. There are too many unknowns. They can be solved, but they can be managed. So, digital transformation isn't a problem to be solved. Sure, there'll be some problems within it, but digital transformation itself is a complex challenge that has to be managed. Like, when are you done? When are you done? So one of the things I love about my job is I get to work in so many different settings. So we're working in a couple of rural communities around opioid misuse disorder. So talk about a complex challenge. We're working with doctors who are overprescribing. We're working with law enforcement. We're working with people and families dealing with addiction. That's not something we're ever probably going to solve, unfortunately. And we see it shift beneath our feet. So, it may be opioids for a while, and then it's it's meth another time. So addiction isn't a complicated problem to be solved. It's a complex challenge to be managed. So digital transformation, I would argue, is not a technical problem to be solved. It is rather a complex challenge that can be managed. So let's go back to our toaster and house plant. And as I said, our organizations, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because it's hard to be both. Because it's almost asking us to be ambidextrous as an organization and as leaders leading them. We have to be able to operate and predict and optimize. At the same time, we have to be agile. So there are two different kind of organizational structures that help us do those things. We have hierarchies and we have networks. So hierarchies help us do the predictable stuff where there needs to be a lot of accountability. But when we need to innovate, when we need to transform, well, networks are better organizational structures for that. So I'm going to ask you to use your chat feature. I'm going to ask you to use your chat feature and respond to this question. Use the chat feature to note some of the functions of digital transformation that you think are best managed in a hierarchy, where you just tell people what they need to do and they do it. So use your chat feature. Let's see what a few of you come up with. Anybody?
Scott, we're actually getting some of the responses in the questions feature, which is fine too. Some answers that we have are assembly line, point of sales, setting up stuff like documents and forms, and access management.
All right, great. Those are good examples. Now I'm going to ask you another question. Again, use that chat feature to note some of the functions of digital transformation that are best managed in a network, in a flat network. And then when some of those come in, Courtney, you can read us what you're hearing.
Will do. Here, now they're all coming in quick. Training, R&D, finding a requirement for each node, deciding on what should be changed are a few of the answers we've gotten thus far.
All right. Thanks.
Process improvement. Let's see if we give us just another second. Anybody else have any other answers they'd like to share? Looks like that's it.
All right, great. Well, let's continue to think about these two different organizational structures and what value they provide, and then how we manage this dynamic of kind of having them both at work in our organization. So I told you earlier we're gonna talk about the S-curve. So here's the S-curve, traditional S-curve that you've probably seen describe a lot of different things. Of course, if you had a mirror image of that S-curve that descended down the back end, well, that's the product life cycle, right? So everything has a beginning, it has a period of growth, and then it has a period of maturing, and then it can go down the backside of the hill. But we're going to just talk about the front side, so the classic S-curve. Networks are really helpful at the beginning stages of the S-curve, but an organization needs to kick in with its hierarchy and hierarchical thinking near the top of that S-curve. So S-curve is used to describe a lot of things: technologies, organizations, communities, even entire economies. And we're mostly talking about organizations here. when it comes to these S curves, they start out at a time where we're kind of exploring and innovating. We're figuring out what transformation looks like. We're wondering what the next product we will release into the market. And then we build and design the thing, right? And then we optimize and regulate it. And then we guard and try to preserve our profit and our value. And the organization kind of evolves from this more network-based thinking and working to this more hierarchical focused working. And those are normal stages. And when you have years, sometimes decades of a growth cycle, well, it works pretty well. You're able to morph from those early days in a growth curve, whether it's your first one as a new enterprise or a second or third growth curve, and then evolving into guarding and preserving and optimizing and regulating. So let's look at some of those really long growth curves, right? So if you think about kind of the industrial revolutions, and if you work for a company that's been around forever, you can probably see evidence of this journey. Or if your company is new, you could probably look at your industry segment and kind of see it as well. So if you think about, when we talk about Industry 4.0, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about, the early days of the Industrial Revolution gave way to kind of the second wave of mass production and assembly lines, and then the third around computers and automation, and now we're talking about a fourth, where we have a digital, physical way of doing work, and our business models are changing and have changed in each of those regards. And again, as I said, hierarchies are good at the earlier stages of a given growth curve, as well as the decades-long growth of the Industrial Revolution, right? I mean, think about the kind of company that Henry Ford built 110 years ago, however long Ford Motor Company's been around now. Very hierarchical. Everyone knew who was in charge of Ford Motor Company, right? But now, think about the way in which value is created today. It's much more networked based. So here's something that I think complicates things even more. Hyperconnectivity, like we're seeing in Internet of Things, and being able to move goods and services and information easier than we ever have, that hyperconnectivity means that S curves are happening faster. So we used to be able to count on a growth curve or an S curve lasting, I don't know, sometimes 75 years. They don't last 75 years anymore. So here's I think, a fascinating example. So if you look at the Standard & Poor's, if we had a list of the Standard & Poor's in 1920, the companies that made up the Standard & Poor's in 1920, and we averaged the age of those firms at the time, well, the average age was 67 years old. So this is 1920. That means these are companies that had been around since 1850. Now, if you printed out a copy of the firms that are on the Standard & Poor's today, the average age of the firm is 15 years. So S-curve, I think that's an indication that these S-curves are happening faster than they ever have. So what does that mean in our organization? It means that we are transitioning from one growth curve to another growth curve almost continuously. So just the time we see the earliest signs of growth slowing, we need to be thinking about transformation again. And digital transformation helps us do that. It helps us spot those opportunities and take advantage of those opportunities faster. So strategic transformation means transitioning from one stage to the next along one growth curve and then frequently jumping to new S-curves. And each of us is best suited for a different phase of the S-curve. Some of us are really good at those earlier stages of transformation where we're exploring, we're innovating, we're looking for new opportunities. Others of us really kick in when it comes to build and design stuff. That happens to be where I kind of find myself. I recognize a good idea, a good product. I can help design it and build it. And then we need to optimize and regulate. We need to put in place those hierarchical structures. And then eventually we need to guard and preserve. So strategic transformation requires different kind of leadership that is shared, collaborative, and cognitively diverse. And we're not going to spend much time talking about that, but it's a really important element. So again, what does that mean? It means the strategic transformation becomes continuous and collaborative. So if we're constantly thinking about how we spin out of our current growth cycle and move into another, that means we are collaborating with people in a frequency and intensity that we are not used to. And I think this is part of what makes strategic transformation so difficult. It requires a level of collaboration and a level of co-creation that many of our organizations just aren't used to doing. So enter some of the work that I do. We focus on something called strategic doing. So strategic doing enables people to form action-oriented collaborations very quickly, move them toward measurable outcomes, and make adjustments along the way. So let's talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. So one of the reasons that strategic transformation and digital transformation especially can be so difficult is because we are using tools designed for complicated to try to do the complex, and they don't work very well. So just one example is strategic planning. So there is data out there that says 70% of strategic plans never get executed, or they fail completely. And it's because strategic planning is a tool for a different age. It's a tool to deal with complicated. It's not a tool to deal with complex. So we design strategic doing for these complex adaptive networks. So strategy, whether it's a digital transformation strategy or some other sort of strategy, really involves these two questions. Where are we going? How will we get there? Where are we going? How will we get there? The approach that we focus on, we break those two questions into four. Let me show you what those four questions are. So first we ask, what could we do? All right, we need to transform digitally. Well, there's probably lots of pathways for us to do that. So what could we do? Well, there's a lot of things we could do. So we have to decide what should we do. We have to rule some things in, rule some things out. And once we decide what we should do, well, then we need to make commitments about what we will do. And then the last question of strategic doing is, what's our 30-30? And what that means, that's kind of our shorthand for saying we need to do this kind of planning in short time buckets. Our rule of thumb is every 30 days. You refresh that. So when you answer those first two questions, what could we do? What should we do? You answer that first big question of strategy. You know where you're going. You've got some outcomes. When you answer those second two questions, you have your pathway. You know how you're going to get there. So underneath those four questions is a set of 10 rules. And we're not going to go into all these rules. We're just going to give you a taste of one of them. But these are 10 rules that we see govern the kinds of strategic conversations and the strategic actions that help organizations transform. So we have looked at hundreds, probably thousands of different strategic transformations and found that those that are successful follow a similar pattern and trajectory. And these 10 skills and there are 10 rules, and then a set of 10 skills to help you apply those rules are important to map that trajectory and that pattern. So we're going to focus just on one as we finish up today. So the second rule of strategic transformation, what we call strategic doing, is to frame strategic conversations in our organizations around appreciative questions. Well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, this is where we have done this work, and following those 10 rules seems to be pretty universal for a lot of folks. And I'm going to skip ahead to a couple of these things, and we're going to focus on that rule number 2, framing conversations with the right questions. So why is that important? It's important because people move based on their conversations. So people move in the direction of their conversations. And in our organizations, sometimes we get stuck in problem-centric conversations. Transformation requires opportunity-focused conversations, and that's not just a difference in semantics. So let's look at how we can construct appreciative questions that point us toward opportunities. So there's a continuum of the kinds of questions that we have to ask in our organizations, and the most strategic kinds of questions start with the words that you see on the right side of that continuum. What would? What would is a better starter for a strategic conversation than which one or who should? So let's look at a couple of other aspects. We really like to pair an opportunity-focused conversation starter with the word imagine. So here's a real-life problem that an organization came to us. Our maintenance downtime is way too high. They've been having conversations for months, for years about that. They try to do root cause analysis. Guess what? It just kept spiraling down to more problems, more problems, more problems, and more problems. So we came in and we said, all right, well, let's rethink that. Let's come up with an appreciative question that starts with an imagine word. So imagine a condition-based maintenance system that greatly reduces our downtime, further enhancing the ability to execute our mission. What would that look like? That's what pointed us toward the opportunities that emerged in order to reduce maintenance downtime. It's when the conversation changed is when the strategy began to be actualized. So let's bring this back to Industry 4.0, digital transformation. So there are a lot of frameworks out there, and you've probably seen them all. Here's one from PricewaterhouseCoopers. So they have 7 elements of digital transformation, and one of those elements is this one. They say digital transformation includes digitization and integration of vertical and horizontal value chains. Well, okay, but how do you do that? So we think you start by coming up with an appreciative question. So let's say we are ABC Manufacturing. So imagine ABC Manufacturing as the hub of a fully digitized, integrated partner ecosystem characterized by a shared set of self-optimized, virtualized processes and near real-time access to an extended set of operative information. What would that look like? Yeah, there's a lot packed in there, but if you're in that business, you know what those words means, right? So we ask, imagine it. Imagine it. It doesn't exist right now, but imagine it. Well, what would it look like? So what do we do next? Well, remember, that's just one rule. So we take a problem, we reframe it as a conversation, and then we use these rules to come up with our strategy. We uncover hidden assets within the network of people that are coming together to ask that question. And then we link and leverage those assets to create new opportunities. And then we rank all the opportunities, all the things we could do to find the big easy, the big ideas, the big potentially transformational ideas that are easy for us to execute, relatively so. And you can see the other rules there. And following those rules relentlessly relentlessly is what leads to transformation. So you can use these rules. You can use these rules to guide the conversations and the actions of the people within your organization that will lead to your digital transformation. So here's one of the ways in which we've done that. So a company might have 3 focus areas that they're working on their digital transformation, and we set up these ad hoc teams, and they work on these focus areas with a set of Pathfinder projects, and have a way to iteratively move those projects along, and you reach an inflection point. You reach an inflection point where the digital transformation begins to show results. So it gave you a taste of how the application of just one of those rules can kind of jumpstart your work in digital transformation. We're going to send you something. These rules are noted in this book, Strategic Doing. We're not going to send you the book, unfortunately, but what we are going to send you is a PDF of a workbook. And you don't have to read the book to use the workbook. But that workbook will go deeper on framing the conversation with the right question. So the element of transformation that we talked about for just a minute, I walk you through some reflective exercises, give you a template to help you begin to ask really powerful, appreciative questions about your digital transformation strategy and other kinds of strategic transformation that you're trying to engage in. So I'm going to stop. We have about 13, 14 minutes left for Q&A, and turn it back over to Brittany to facilitate the Q&A.
All right, everyone, if you have any questions, go ahead and type those in our question box there. Feel free to add those questions there. Let's see what's coming in. One question for you, Scott. Do you think that hierarchical organizational structures are going away?
I don't. I know there are some that do, but as I said, hierarchies are good for some stuff. You guys on the call identified some of those things, and like I said, we're just going to have to do both. We're going to have to be able to manage a hierarchy at the same time we're managing a more network, flatter approach, and get better at determining what strategic aspects of our organizations are better done in one versus the other. So our leaders are really having to be ambidextrous. We have heard some of our employers who hire our graduates, our engineering graduates and our technology graduates, use this phrase that I think is really interesting and insightful. So they say something to the effect of, we hire these really bright young people, and we want them to keep their head down and solve problems for us. But then in about 5-6 years, we need them to lift their head up and look around. So what they're saying is that they need to look around at the network, at the larger enterprise, and look for those horizontal connections, and it's not easy for them. We hire them to be good vertical thinkers, but then we're also expecting them to be good horizontal thinkers, and it's tough to do both.
Thanks, Scott. We had another question come in through the chat. What is the most common stopper to the change conversation, or to change the conversation?
What is the most common showstopper from keeping it to change, from it successfully changing? One would be focusing on, I'm going to call them sore heads. So sometimes we talk about there's 3 different types of people in an organization. There are the early adapters, the more entrepreneurial thinkers, always up for trying something new. And they're usually a fairly small fraction, 5, 10%. Well, there's another small fraction, 5 or 10%, that are the never adapters or the soreheads. And they're a small percentage too, 5, 10%. 80% of us are just pragmatics. So if you plot these on a bell curve, they're the both of those minority populations are on the edges, and 80% of us are in the middle. We're just pragmatics. So we sometimes will let one of the soreheads stop the conversation in full view of all the pragmatics, then we don't engage the pragmatics. So I try to just disregard the soreheads. You don't have to have everyone at the table. You have to have some of the people at the table. And our job is, if you're one of those early adopters, getting a few of those pragmatics engaged in your transformation effort. And then they will get a few, and then they will get a few. And pretty soon you reach critical mass that the storeheads don't matter anymore because their voice is dwarfed because the pragmatics have joined the voice of the others.
Thank you, Scott. We have another one from Mark. How can you persuade higher levels of management in a rather hierarchical company when you are not part of said management layers?
Yeah, that's a tough one. What I have found is that, higher management, whether they're hierarchical or not, they respect productivity. So if you can get more stuff done, they're going to give you more leeway. Hierarchical organizations are hierarchical for a reason, or the hierarchical aspects of them, and they have an immune response. So there are people typically at the top of the organization that benefit from the hierarchy, and seeing a threat to it is a threat to them. So the immune response is triggered. So when we're trying to introduce a new way of thinking, a new way of doing strategic work, we start with lower risk pilots. So we say, hey, there's seems to be a complex issue we've been working on for a while. We're not making any traction. It's not the biggest issue in our organization, but it's a stubborn one. Let's try a new approach. Can we try? Can we try a new approach? And then demonstrate, if it does, demonstrate that new approach works. And then they say, all right, well, let's tackle another problem. And you become known as the go-to person for these complex challenges. So you're reducing risk a little bit at a time every time you have an early success. That's one of the reasons we talk about the big easy. We'll find something that's a big easy to start with. Fairly big. If we solve it, we solve a problem that keeps us up at night. Probably don't want to start with the biggest problem, but it's going to be relatively easy for us. So that's where we like to start and demonstrate that this different way of thinking and different way of tackling strategic transformation can work.
Thank you, Scott. We have time for just a few more questions. Let's see. Mark said, thanks, that's enlightening. So also, why do you think it's so easy to mistake complex challenges for complicated problems?
Oh, that's a good question. We are so conditioned to be problem solvers. So this book's a little bit esoteric, but I think it's pretty remarkable. And I'm actually looking at it right now in my office. As I thought about it, my eyes turned toward my bookshelf, and there it is. So it's a book called Images of Organizations, and it's all about the metaphors that we use for our organizations. And the predominant metaphor for the last 100 years has been the organization as machine. Because if you took any like org development or HR in school, remember Frederick Taylor. So Frederick Taylor was the father of scientific management. So he was the guy that would go to the factory and time every single micro move that people made and look for kind of the science of improving it. So Lean, Six Sigma, TQM, even the discipline of engineering, all emerged out of scientific management. And that if you ever stop and make a list of all the language that we use about our organizations that is kind of machine-like language, it's mind-boggling. So I think that we're so conditioned to think of our organizations as machines, we have to be very deliberate at thinking about them in other ways. So this images of organization, it says one of the images is the machine, but the other is the ecosystem. The other is the complex adaptive system. How do we think of our organizations as living systems, and how would that change? So I think we're not used to thinking in terms of complexity. We're used to thinking in terms of complicated, because the complicated is an artifact of the organization as a machine, and complexity is an artifact of the organization as a complex adaptive system. And we're just not used to thinking about our organizations in that way.
Thank you again. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, Scott, for joining us today, and thank you all for joining in and watching the webinar. Here is Scott's contact information if you have some follow-up questions. A recording of the presentation will also be available shortly, as well as that workbook that Scott had mentioned. I also invite you all to tune in to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Scott was a guest on episode 8 of the podcast if you want to go back and check that one out. Also, new episodes are released every Wednesday on your favorite podcast streaming platforms. You can also find Digital Enterprise Society on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Once again, I am Courtney McWhirter. If you have any questions at all about the Digital Enterprise Society, I am happy to help. Digital Enterprise Society is a new nonprofit member association organized to enable the transformation of product development, design, delivery, and maintenance throughout the digital enterprise.